Does the Bible teach the law of assumption? Millions of people believe the Bible teaches the law of assumption. Millions of Christians say that's impossible. So, why do so many people keep pointing to the same verses? The deeper I looked, the stranger the rabbit hole became. It led me into neuroscience consciousness and one of the biggest debates in modern science. But before we get there, we have to answer a much simpler question. Why do people think the Bible teaches the law of assumption? Most people assume the law of assumption came from modern self-help, but that's not actually where one of its biggest teachers said he learned it. Neville Goddard argued that the Bible wasn't just a religious book. He believed it wasn't simply recording history, it was revealing timeless principles about belief, consciousness, and identity. That's why almost every one of his lectures eventually led back to Scripture. Not just one verse, but dozens. And that's where our investigation begins. The deeper I looked, the more a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just one passage. The same idea seemed to appear throughout the Bible. In Mark 11:24, Jesus says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." In Proverbs 23:7, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." In Matthew 9:29, Jesus tells two blind men, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And Hebrews 11:1 describes faith as, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Different books, different authors, different centuries. Yet many people believe they're all pointing toward the same underlying principle. So is that just a coincidence? Or have people connected verses that were never meant to fit together? Because before we answer that, we have to leave theology for a moment and ask, what does modern science actually say about belief? It turns out the answer is surprisingly well studied. Can belief actually change the brain? Surprisingly, yes. Modern neuroscience has discovered that the brain isn't fixed. It's constantly changing, adapting, and rewiring itself based on what we repeatedly think, practice, and believe. Scientists call this neuroplasticity. Every repeated thought strengthens certain neural pathways, making those patterns more automatic over time. The more often you think a certain way, the easier it becomes for your brain to think that way again. But it doesn't stop there. Those beliefs begin shaping the decisions you make, the opportunities, you notice the risks you're willing to take, and even the identity you build for yourself. In other words, what you repeatedly believe doesn't just influence how you think, it influences how you experience the world around you. And that's what made me stop. Because suddenly, verses about faith started sounding less like abstract theology and more like something connected to the way our minds actually work. But that leads to an even bigger question. If belief can reshape the brain, what exactly is consciousness? Because despite centuries of scientific discovery, one question still remains. What is consciousness? We know the brain processes information. We can measure electrical activity. We can even watch different regions become active during certain thoughts or emotions. But none of that fully explains why we're aware of any of it. Why do we experience a sense of self? Why are we conscious at all? And that's exactly why consciousness has become one of the biggest mysteries in modern science. Some researchers believe our expectations shape how we perceive the world around us, not because they magically change reality, but because they influence what we notice, what we focus on, and ultimately the decisions we make. Which raises an interesting question. When the Bible talks about faith, belief, and the renewing of the mind, was it describing something far deeper than we've traditionally assumed? And that's where I found something I wasn't expecting. One of the most fascinating experiments ever performed is called the double-slit experiment. It has puzzled physicists for more than a century. Here's why. Scientists discovered that tiny particles like electrons don't always behave the way we'd expect. Sometimes they behave like particles. Other times, they behave like waves. That alone was surprising. But what made the experiment famous was what happened when scientists measured which path the particles took. The results changed. Over the years, this experiment has sparked countless debates. Some people argue it points toward a deeper connection between observation and reality. Others say those conclusions go far beyond what the experiment actually demonstrates. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating. Because suddenly we're no longer talking only about the Bible, we're talking about consciousness, observation, and the nature of reality itself, which brings us back to where this investigation began. Does the Bible teach the law of assumption? The answer depends entirely on how you read those verses. Some people believe they describe God's power alone. Others believe they reveal a timeless principle about belief consciousness and the way human beings experience reality. Modern neuroscience has shown that belief can reshape the brain. Physics has raised questions that scientists are still debating, and the Bible has been asking many of those same questions for thousands of years. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Or maybe we're only beginning to understand how deeply faith belief and consciousness are connected. So now it's your turn. Did Neville Goddard misunderstand these verses? Or did he notice something most people have overlooked? Comment your opinion below. I'll be reading every argument.